last minute with a paper substituting for Gina Schouten. So I'd like to introduce Michael Tiboris from University of California, San Diego, Department of Philosophy, who will speak on college undermatch and personal autonomy.
Okay. All right, so yeah, that's right. So it's a real shame that Gina couldn't make it. It wasn't her fault, and so you get subjected to another Tiboris paper. But undermatching. I didn't have time to put slides together either, so I'm going to rely a little bit more on the text than I normally would. So apologies for that. So we know an encouraging amount about students who go to post-secondary schools. We have some sense about where they're from socioeconomically, what their educational background is like. We also are able to identify rates of college completion and the typical time to degree within these groups. However, we don't know as much about the surprisingly large population of students who are qualified for college or qualified for certain types of colleges, but simply don't apply, or who apply to colleges that don't match their academic abilities. Undermatched is the term that we use to describe students who choose to attend a post-secondary school which is less selective than those for which they're academically qualified. Or perhaps qualified to go to college and they just don't apply. Rates of academic undermatching are significant across all income levels, though they are much higher for students from poorer families or students whose parents are not themselves college educated. So recent studies have noted that selective universities were able to enroll only 36% of the well-qualified seniors who came from families with no previous experience of higher education, and only 41% of those families in the bottom quartile of the income distribution. These students are, based on all the usual metrics of assessment, just as academically qualified as their wealthier peers, but they nevertheless enroll in less selective post-secondary institutions or no college at all. Other studies in the last 3 years or so have found that even using a quote, conservative definition of undermatch, about 41% of students enroll in a college below the selectivity level that they could attend. This is across all income levels. Further, a full 16% of students substantially undermatch by enrolling in a college that's far less selective than the one that they might. For example, by enrolling in a 2-year program when they're eligible for a somewhat selective institution, a 4-year institution. And data from the data from the Chicago public school system shows us that only about 1/3 of students who aspire to complete a 4-year degree enroll in a college that matches their qualifications. These facts are intuitively troubling. Current political consensus seems to be that we ought to expand opportunities for post-secondary education, especially among first-time college students, to support, among other things, a timely recovery from the economic crisis. At the level of personal welfare, graduation from a more selective institution is strongly correlated with higher pay, lower unemployment rates, and greater access to things like insurance and pensions upon graduation. Not terribly surprising. But remember that these advantages also translate into further welfare gains, like the ability to more quickly pay off student loan debt, better rates of general health, job satisfaction, and job security. Moreover, it's well established that rates of graduation rise and the time to degree falls with the selectivity of the post-secondary school, regardless of whether of prior academic credentials or socioeconomic status. And that's assuming that they're minimally qualified for the university. But once they're in, their academic credentials before they got there tend to approach the normalcy for the institution rather than their past qualifications. So undermatching thus increases the chances of dropping out while it raises the cost of a degree by drawing out the time it takes a person to finish it. And this suggests that students attending a school that they find challenging have notably better outcomes than students who are equally qualified but attend less selective institutions. The correlation between lower parental education and higher rates of undermatching, I think, just further perpetuates this and deepens the cycle. So the question I want to take up now, because I'm not a I'm not an education researcher, I'm a philosopher. So the question I want to take up is a philosophical question. And it's this: what, if anything, is morally problematic about high rates of undermatching among low socioeconomic students, right? Students of low socioeconomic status? Now, the answer to this might seem obvious initially, right? You might think undermatching apparently plays a very significant role in educational inequality by entrenching unequal educational achievement and therefore welfare outcomes. And from a macroscopic level, I think that that's quite plausible. But at the level of personal, at the personal level of the individual, cases of undermatching are somewhat harder to criticize. So think about it, post-secondary educational choices are complex. They're mediated by a range of factors and personal preferences, familial and religious values, cultural pressures, and other contingencies of choice. And given this, undermatching isn't an obviously unreasonable choice. From the perspective of a liberal society, for example, from the perspective of a liberal society which aims to protect multiple personal viewpoints about what counts as a good life, intervention in the lives of these people might also be counterproductive from the perspective of liberalism. Consider, for example, a student who could attend a more selective school but chooses not to, maybe because of perceived, because it would be perceived by people that he cares about as a rejection of their culture, or the rejection of the culture that raised him, or maybe as a challenge to their own intelligence. Such stories are not uncommon. Communities have their own social gravity, and acceding to it can mean trading off opportunities for welfare for more comfortable values. There's nothing wrong with developing preferences specific to a particular way of life, even when this means foreclosing opportunities that others think are important. Liberal theories of education, in particular, want to give serious authority to individuals' choices about what kinds of lives to lead and what kinds of preferences to develop. Choices about post-secondary education are undoubtedly among those that they aim to protect. But the fact that undermatching both predicts lower welfare outcomes and disproportionately affects the poor demands further ethical investigation. So what, if anything, is wrong with undermatching from the perspective of educational justice? My answer to this question is that in many cases, our attitude about undermatching should depend on whether or not the choice to undermatch is made autonomously. It's a good philosophy word. By autonomous here, this is sort of what I mean. I mean that a person has come to have this preference over which they can reasonably claim some kind of ownership, having acquired it under adequately free conditions. This definition is necessarily vague, but it has two important components. Free condition of acquisition and something like ownership of the preference, which is required for assessment, things like being responsible for it, being accountable to it. There are reasons to think, and I'll argue in a second, that preferences for undermatch can be both acquired non-autonomously, and lead to inegalitarian welfare outcomes. And that this is, since it's a more significant problem for students from low SES backgrounds, low socioeconomic status backgrounds, that this represents an important kind of educational injustice. So to do this, we need to identify, I think, what it means. Ultimately, we have to identify what it means to have an autonomous preference, even when we acknowledge that the sources of people's preferences come from things that they don't have autonomous control over. So they're to a great degree impacted by social institutions that surround them as they develop, and nobody denies this. If there's any sense to be made out of autonomous educational choices, it has to be made in that context, assuming that. In fact, so I'm not going to argue that autonomy is the only question or problem with undermatching. In fact, in a second, I'm going to give some other examples of moral problems I think that are attached to undermatching. But I do want to highlight the autonomy-related problems because I think they're underexplored and still significant. As a quick aside, autonomy figures in another way here too. Many philosophers of education and people who work in education policy will say that it's an important aim to give students a real opportunity to become the kind of autonomous adults whose choices about what kind of life they lead deserve respect, are protected from undue paternalism, and can ground claims of responsibility. And if undermatching poses or exposes serious barriers to this, then that's a problem as well. The difficulty in all of this will be identifying how questions of autonomy can be met with concrete policy-relevant answers. I'm not going to talk as much about that problem in the rest of this. I'll talk more about the first autonomy problem. So what's wrong with undermatching? Perhaps the most significant problem with undermatching is that it prevents people from achieving higher levels of education that they otherwise might. How bad this is depends on the value of post-secondary education. If education's value is partly intrinsic, then it's easy to see why wealth-based exclusions from it are problematic. I'm personally a little skeptical that education's value is substantially intrinsic, but by that, that's, again, this is sort of philosophy-ish. I just mean that it's valuable for its own sake. I'm personally skeptical that education's value is substantially intrinsic, but I'm not going to argue for that. And instead I'll merely say that even if education had substantially intrinsic value, this wouldn't show that undermatching is morally problematic. Individual intrinsic values could be swamped by more important instrumental values. For example, even if getting a college degree has intrinsic worth, the cost of getting it might be unjustifiably high. So this argument is a bit easier to make, I think, when we're talking about undermatching than it would be for primary education, since the former is largely elective. Right? Going to college is largely elective. It adds value to a life rather than providing a person with the basic constituents of a valuable life. That may turn out to be false in the future, but as of right now, we still think of college as elective. Whether or not post-secondary education has intrinsic value, it certainly has instrumental value. It opens up employment opportunities, the range of economic and social benefits that a person has access to. Undermatching is a moral problem in some instances then, just because it amplifies the background injustice that educational theories are already worried about. In this case, it's not a unique problem of educational justice. It's just an extension of other problems of educational inequality, a further mechanism by which the achievement gap is reinforced. There are significant benefits to attending the most selective school one can attend, and students who undermatch are poised to get fewer of those benefits. The prima facie harm here becomes an injustice, though, if the causes of that disproportionate amount of undermatching among the poor is unjustifiable. The fact that we're addressing post-secondary education and not primary education is again significant. Part of the reason for thinking that the achievement gap is a moral problem comes from the perception that its causes are largely beyond the control of the children affected by it. This cannot be as easily said about undermatching, which affects older people who are presumably capable of making their own educational decisions. I'm not claiming that high school students who are making decisions about college are totally competent to make decisions about whatever, but they're certainly capable to a certain extent of making those kinds of choices. So it's not so easy as, you can't use the same argument that you might against the achievement gap in this case, I don't think. Many individual cases of undermatching, I think, are hard to quarrel with. A person's choices, including those about pursuing further education, are mediated by a complex set of psychological and causal factors. While we can acknowledge that any specific individual may objectively benefit from a matched secondary education, they may nevertheless autonomously reject a preference for it. Undermatched students are very likely to be able to give, I think, subjectively compelling reasons for their educational choices. Wanting to stay closer to home, a desire to maintain cultural or religious practices, personal distaste for city life, dislike of the school mascot. Right? I mean, the list goes on. While one might disagree with them about the relative value of these reasons, to the extent that we think that they're at least minimally competent agents able to make and entitled to make certain kinds of decisions about their education, then these are choices about the kind of life that they want to lead. And it's far from clear that such reasons have no merit at all, that decisions to undermatch have no merit at all. Saying that undermatching is always a bad thing, I think, means rejecting such subjectively defended preferences as something like they're illusory or irrational or unreasonable. That said, any analysis of autonomous agency has to make room for the possibility that autonomous agents can make seriously bad decisions which are at odds with their own best interest. If it were if we were to insist that only substantively valuable choices could be autonomous, then this would restrict the scope of autonomy, I think, quite dramatically, and lead to some fairly radical skepticism about its everyday occurrence. We shouldn't be willing to accept that, I don't think. So it's unlikely, and I think to a certain extent a little insulting to assume that whenever low SES students undermatch, they're not being properly reflective about the values that they have. And it seems straightforwardly wrong to me to think that they cannot autonomously choose to undermatch, regardless of whether doing so is a good or bad decision. But as plausible as it is that undermatching can be chosen autonomously, it's implausible to think that students are completely free to avoid undermatching if they just simply chose to do so. To the extent that we know that social conditioning and coercive cultural institutions run very deep, it would not be surprising to see patterns of value in high undermatched groups, which are drawn away from education. Such preferences may take the form of cultural injunctions against further education, which can come from either a person's home influences or the receptivity of the collegiate environment to lower socioeconomic students. It's too strong, of course, to say that these factors completely undermine the autonomous agency of students. I mean, they're not causally determining of what they do. And after all, there are many students who buck these patterns. And of course, these students are certainly still autonomous in the sense of being able to make choices without being like actively coerced or restrained in what they do. Yet, if low SES students come to believe that higher education isn't really for people like them, because the surrounding culture and home life don't place a value on going to college, or the colleges sort of in various subtle ways let them know that they're not welcome, then they'll develop a preference against applying. Poor access to competent and comprehensive guidance counseling, I think, also contributes to an information gap here. And as things stand, low SES students are frequently unaware of the substantial funding opportunities available to them that could make going to a selective college, in lots of instances, actually cheaper for them than going to a less selective two-year school. So the punchline is that students' social experience shapes their sense of themselves and how valuable education is and what their available options are. While undermatching can be unjust simply by blocking access to good welfare outcomes or by reinforcing familiar forms of educational inequality, it sometimes is unjust because it arises from diminished autonomy, which substantially depends on economic inequality, I think. In other cases, the choice to undermatch may be autonomous based on reasonable personal commitments that a person sincerely takes to be quite important. In such cases, it's less clear that the resulting inequality is unjust. Whether it is, as I'll suggest in a second, depends on how we understand what autonomy means in the context of post-secondary educational choice. But for the moment, it's worth noting that while personal autonomy in one's choices is an important indicator of individual cases of undermatching, whether individual cases of undermatching are unjust, even securing widespread autonomous educational choice would not guarantee educational justice. Poorer students may simply be more conservative about paying for college, which is expensive. It requires them to forego income that they could have by just joining the labor market right away. States are pulling back funding for these kinds of students, so it's harder and harder for them. They might think, well, you know, is that money going to be there when I finish my degree? So, of course, these sorts of cuts disproportionately affect the poor. And so it might be rational for them to avoid college, even as the factors that make this rational also make it unjust. Right? It could be both unjust and totally rational. In such cases, the public policy response seems like it should be fairly straightforward. We ought to offer bigger scholarships to poor students, and maybe try to defray some of the cost, the risk of taking on debt by, Dick Arneson suggested this to me, that they do this in Australia, repaying loans afterwards tied to how much money you make after you graduate. So the rate at which you have to pay back is tied to your post-graduation wealth. But there are at least a couple of reasons, I think, to think that monetary interventions alone in the undermatching problem wouldn't be enough to address many of the problems that I'm most concerned with. Bowen there's a study, the 2009 study, that sort of launched this discussion about undermatching. And they note that differences in price between selective and less selective institutions are not a significant cause of undermatching. Because in most instances, what's happening is they're not dealing with students who are choosing between either Harvard or the local community college, right? They're choosing between levels of selectivity that are closer together. Most often the choices between those levels and the price differences between, say, like a selective college and a somewhat selective college are not significant enough to explain the high rates of undermatching that occur. Additionally, the significant amount of undermatching which happens at high SES levels, and it is quite significant, it's less than it is at the low SES levels, but it's still pushing 20%, probably means that at least some cases of undermatching are not strictly financial. Whatever the reasons are that lead these students to undermatch is very likely present in the low SES cases as well. Maybe that's a leap, I have to think about that. Another alternative explanation for undermatching comes from the belief that greater rates of undermatching among poorer students can be significantly explained by differences in, for example, motivation or perseverance, which don't show up on tests used to establish how qualified they are for selected schools. And so some of the things we've heard today might actually be reinforcing that idea. So two things that have to be clarified here in order to make this argument compelling. First, you'd have to establish that the empirical fact of this link between personal motivation and poverty is not just like baldly elitist, backward inference from the fact that they're not doing as well, and so therefore they're not trying as hard. But secondly, I think more importantly, even if we were able to establish some significant motivational deficits among low SES students, in order to claim that this is not also a site of injustice, we'd have to show that the cause of these deficits is itself not morally suspicious, but I would expect that it would be, for the same reasons that I think the causes of undermatching are morally suspicious. For example, unequal access to school resources can create a school culture in poorer neighborhoods in which students don't develop the expectation that their peers will go to college. This kind of thing can be reinforced in a number of passive ways. Anyone who's spent time in a wealthy college prep high school knows that you can tell the amount of effort that goes into creating a culture which simply presumes that students will go to college. Similarly, in poor schools, simply getting students to graduate is often quite a challenge, and there just aren't enough resources to support the relatively small number of qualified students who go on to further schooling. And so if the motivational issues here are traceable just to school culture, which is then traceable to economic differences or economic inequality, then the problem just resurfaces there. So these arguments they allow the interesting and difficult question about the moral status of undermatching to be stated a little bit more sharply. How, if at all, is the prima facie harm of undermatching affected by a person's choice to undermatch? The answer to this question, I've been trying to suggest, depends on our beliefs about personal autonomy and whether it reconciles the internal and external reasons for this choice that people make. Liberal education theorists in particular must address this problem carefully because it makes undermatching reminiscent of other familiar challenges to liberal egalitarianism. These challenges are presented most often through examples of people who appear to reflectively endorse, freely take on, or defend chosen ways of life that substantially undermine their access to welfare. And so consider the classic feminist examples of adaptive preference in women who choose to participate in social institutions and practices that negatively impact their access to justice. While living in a strictly gender-structured society, which objectively limits their access to welfare, they choose and subjectively endorse often the very norms and way of life that limit their welfare. And this puts feminist liberals in an uncomfortable position of either having to say that no competent woman could actually choose to live under those conditions, or that subjective endorsement of oppression renders it morally acceptable. Similarly, I think with the issue of undermatching, it may settle on whether low SES students can make good non-optimal welfare choices on the basis of culture and socialization and successfully defend them as a principled, authentic stance. In both of these cases, gender oppression and undermatching, the question seems to be whether a person can autonomously choose a way of life that contributes to their own inequality of opportunity. It wouldn't be surprising, I don't think, to find that students who undermatch are led to do so by social forces similar to those that normalize their performance once they actually matriculate. So we know that regardless of qualifications when enrolling, students' performance, dropout rates, and time to degree tend to normalize with the selectivity of the school. In other words, two equally qualified students who go to universities of different selectivity are ultimately more likely to have completion statistics typical for the school rather than for their qualifications at that school. These normalizing pressures, I think, are features of social environments generally, not just schools. And students from low SES backgrounds whose parents are less educated are probably more likely to follow the behavioral trends of the peer group that surrounds them than those indicated just by their level of aptitude. This would be an easy thing to criticize, I think, if the social forces were strongly causal in ways that mediated by choice, or if they necessarily caused a student to trade the concrete welfare benefits of further education for demonstrably less valuable alternative goods. But I don't think either of these is the case. There are clearly social barriers, for example, to low SES minority entrants to universities whose students are predominantly white and come from greatly different social backgrounds. Not all of these pressures are external either. No one wants to be, for example, the representative of their race, religion, or their socioeconomic class at a university. Additionally, there's little reason to think that attending a matched post-secondary school is necessarily better than undermatching, or even attending no college at all. To make that argument, one would have to show that things like fidelity to a culture which values ways of life are at odds with post-secondary schooling, or the way that it's provided, and that they're always or inherently less valuable than those benefits than schooling is. This seems deeply implausible to me. However, we shouldn't overstate the case. Maintaining cultural fidelity at all costs is, in many cases, evidence of just massive ignorance about alternative lifestyles and ways of being. And part of the point of college is to put these students in contact with other people who are not like them, expand their sense of community, expand their sense of themselves. And that this helps them make informed decisions about the kind of life that more informed decisions about the kind of life that they want to lead. In either case, focusing too narrowly on, I think, primarily economic returns for a college education downplays the importance of these types of experiences. So in a longer version of this paper, I deal with some of the policy issues that I think this raises, some of the policy challenges that it raises. But I just want to end by suggesting something briefly about that. So a comprehensive policy dealing with the degree of undermatching is going to have to address the difference, I think, between reasonable and unreasonable cases of undermatch in order to justify intervention on any person or group's behalf. The difference between these, I've tried to suggest, although not in all cases, but at least some of the time, is that unreasonable cases of undermatching, those around which we ought to build interventionist policy, are cases where the preference for undermatching is not justified by an autonomous choice. If I'm correct about the autonomy problem with undermatching, then from the dominant perspective of liberal education, it would be important to say something more about what constitutes an autonomous choice in post-secondary education. Thank you.